And we're live. It's Tuesday. I'm Eddie Stone. Nice of you to join me today. A little later in the day than we normally are. We thought we'd try to catch a few folks on the West Coast on mid-afternoon, and certainly have looked forward to a chance to speak to everyone this week. I see we got Maria. Maria, thanks for joining us. Folks, as you log on, love to get you to share where you're logging on from today. I realize that quite a few of the people that we're working with are traveling and out doing some interesting things. Had a chance to speak with a couple ladies today, making a run through the Penn State area of Pennsylvania. So log on and let us know where you're from. Jana, how are you? Jana, you've had a busy travel summer and fall. So anyway, let's go ahead and jump into things today. Our conversation today is about the role of accountability in success. And I realize for a lot of people, you start talking about the role of accountability, they probably think about it differently, right? If you're a parent, you think about it sort of one way. If you're a child, a student, you think about it another way. If you're a professional, you may think of accountability really just only in context of being a professional. No matter who you are or where you're coming from, there's no question that accountability plays a role in the success you enjoy, and particularly if you're in any type of leadership role or a leader by family, your example and the philosophy that you put forward when we talk about accountability is making a difference, not only in your success, but also the type of influence that you enjoy. And it's something that I've been a student of now for a really long time. I started to say some 30 years since I got involved in this industry. I don't know if it's quite been that long that I've sort of confronted this issue, but over time, as I think about success, not only my own success, team success, success of mentors, other people I look at, I really recognize that accountability plays a big role. And for me, it's as much about a philosophy as it is, say, anything else. And so let's talk about what this means, because when we talk about it, there's probably several ways we can describe what accountability is. First, it's responsibility. It's not completely responsibility, but it is really largely about responsibility. It's also about commitment. It's a philosophy. You might think of it in terms of being a way of being, or even if we want to break it down just even deeper, we can say it's an approach to life. And it's really sort of the opposite of what I would describe as a victim mentality, which is a sort of constant topic of discussion. We'll talk to someone and realize they sort of see themselves as a victim, whether the underlying facts would suggest they're not a victim, or whether we see them as perhaps they think of themselves as a victim, but it's their own doing. And so accountability, responsibility, these are things that are sort of opposite of that, because you're sort of accepting the dynamics of the conversation. And I'll give you a place where this has shown up from a practical standpoint in my life, and there's probably quite a few of you that will watch this and resonate with this, or probably have done the very same thing. I think about it in the simplest of terms, like when I've watched ball games with my children growing up. Big fan of college sports, see a lot of college football in the fall, a lot of college basketball throughout the winter months. And it's interesting when you listen to a crowd, particularly if you're at a home game, anytime a ref makes a call that goes against the home crowd, there's immediate outcry of bad refereeing, right? We see referees made fun of on a constant basis, particularly by home crowds. But really, if we were setting two fan bases side by side, we would see that no matter what the ref calls, the other one feels like it was a wrong call, right? It's just sort of the nature of how you own this. But I think actually that's very instructive to think about, right? Because it's all about the paradigm that you approach any sort of circumstances, particularly when there's a subjective quality to them, like something like fast-moving athletics where a referee's making a call. And what I've always felt, and maybe you can relate to this, is that if I'm complaining, particularly complaining in front of my children, then I'm sending a philosophy to them. I'm saying to them, hey, we're a victim of somebody else's mistake or issue. We're now no longer in charge of our own destiny. And I actually think that that's a challenge, because the minute we sort of give up to some outside force, we remove all hope and promise for our circumstances. Now, that's not to say that there aren't victims in life, and I'm certainly not trying to suggest that, and I'm not trying to say that in an absolute term that no one isn't subject to some higher force that they can't control. But from a general philosophical standpoint, I believe, and what I've observed in life is that inside of accountability, ownership of whatever is happening, is hope and a promise for success tomorrow that's driven by your own possibilities. Whereas the other side of this is hopeless, right? If I give up and say, well, I can't do it because of these outside forces, then it's hopeless. And what I've also observed is that if we look around locally, globally, we always are able to find someone that's facing much more difficult set of circumstances than our own. So from a philosophical standpoint, this is really where I come down on this issue, is to take ownership of this. And some of it springs, and we're actually going to post this in the comment section. Some of this actually springs from several books I've read, but maybe the most important, and one of the most important books in my life, is called Man's Search for Meaning by Dr. Viktor Frankl. And I encourage, if you've never read this book, I encourage you to become familiar with Dr. Frankl's work. It's a fairly simple read, although it's a serious subject matter. But it's basically that no matter what is going on, no matter how indignant a set of circumstances can be, that last remaining choice we have is our attitude towards, or our response to, whatever the condition is and whatever is happening, right? So I may be doing the worst kind of work, but I can choose to whistle while I work, or I can choose to privately complain, all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which is a much more serious set of issues. Dr. Frankl was in a concentration camp, and so his discussion of this matter is certainly much more serious in that regard. But it's all the same in terms of if we decide to take ownership, we have a choice in how we respond, and this is the role that accountability can play. Basically, it says that the minute you stop focusing on what's happening to me, and we begin to think about what I can do, is the moment we enjoy a freedom and an opportunity for success that's not there otherwise. So you might say that a philosophy or an attitude is really one of those central components of enjoying success, no matter what your circumstances happen to be. Now, for myself, I've sort of put together four ways of sort of managing this and approaching the idea. Maybe you could make 5, maybe you could make 6. I'd be curious if you want to post into your comments. Hi, Katrina from South Florida. If you want to post into the comments here your own approach to this. But the first one for me is to take ownership either way of my outcomes. And that's one of the very simplest things that we can do, right? And so if you take ownership of the outcome, then what you have a chance to do, one, with that responsibility, is to make an observation of the outcome and think about exactly what you might do to improve that outcome or make tomorrow a better day. A truly responsible person, a person that's truly taking accountability, will do that 100% regardless of whether the outcome is good or bad. Now, you may choose to ease into this, and one of the sort of pro tips I can give you in that regard is to think in terms of process or activity, those things that we have an absolute control over, right? I can determine how many times I attempt to do something. I may not be able to determine the outcome of each of those attempts, but I can determine the process. If you look at a professional athlete like a baseball player who's going to be in 160 some games over the course of a year, going to take a bat during the game 3, 4, and 5 times per night, right? If they focus on each individual outcome, it's probably maddening, right? You could probably really do psychological damage to yourself if you sort of get into a bad streak, one or the other. But if you focus completely on the process and let the outcome follow, accepting responsibility for that, then I believe you can make a difference in not just your outcome itself or the results, but you can also make a difference in your attitude and your ability to endure as it takes time for success to catch up to your effort, right? Which is generally true in no matter what you're doing. So that's first. Number 2, after we sort of say, okay, I'm accountable either way of what occurs, is to recognize within that decision, that's a choice is what I would call it. If you understand that, that gives you power. It actually can help to build esteem and confidence in you that others will notice. Others will notice no matter what if you recognize, hey, this choice I'm making, no matter what's happening to me, good or bad, by making that choice, I'm empowering myself to do something I might not do otherwise. Because no matter what I do, no matter what field I choose, unless there's some type of lottery success or something like that, in general, work is hard. No matter if you're doing it for a modest wage or a high wage, in general, work is hard. School, no matter what, for most people, if they're really engaged in it, it can be challenging, right? And you're going to have good and bad days. You'll score well on a test or poor on a test, but it's the process. Did you do your work? Do you accept responsibility for the work that you did or didn't do, right? Either way, and recognize in that moment, I have a choice, because that's where the power comes from. And I actually think that will drive you through this continuation on, say, an arc, right, of increasing this recognition of accountability and the role it plays in not only individual success, but developing leadership as well as influence. So that's number 2, right? So first is responsibility. Second is to recognize that choice and the power it brings. And then the third for me, maybe the most critical, is the self-examination, or you might call it the observation and the learning, whatever that dialogue is best for you. Because when we observe, right, in an objective way our activities, and I'm not saying critically, right? I'm not talking about anybody beating themselves. I'm not a fan of that whatsoever. What I'm talking about is making an observation, a self-examination, bringing in someone from the outside, like a spouse or a good friend, someone that you know is not going to be a critic just to be a critic, but to help you sort of examine your work activities. Mentors are terrific for this. By doing that bit of self-examination, then you have a chance on a daily basis, instead of focusing on a failure, to focus on the promise of tomorrow, because you accept what happened today, you accept the responsibility for what happened today, you realize that the choice to do that is empowering, and now you can go and improve tomorrow. If you found out you gave yourself a series of tasks that you just weren't able to finish in the time you allotted to yourself, you could say to yourself, well, I'm operating more slowly than anticipated. Or you can say also, hey, I'm just going to get up an hour earlier, right? I'll get up an hour earlier. I'll stay up an hour later to compete until my skills catch up with my goals and allow me to succeed, right? So responsibility, recognition of the power of the choice. The third is that self-examination that you can learn from. And then number 4, this is probably the hardest thing to do. It certainly was for me, is to deal with whatever happens, own it, and get over it no matter what. I would have a tendency when I'm not happy with the result that I've generated, I'm frustrated with work that I'm doing, to not just think about it, but to be consumed by it and let that get in the way of these other dynamics, such as learning from the activity. So number 4 for me is, whatever it is, own it, deal with it, and move on. Because in the grand scheme of things, you can either choose to dwell on it and allow it to be debilitating, or you can choose to learn from it and move on. Because what's happened in the past can inform the future, but it doesn't make the future unless you allow it to, right? If you dwell on the past, it's already happened. In some respects, it doesn't matter. So we can choose to allow it to be an informative situation where we can learn from it and go forward, or we can allow it to be debilitating. Or here's the other aspect of this, which is the worst. You can use it to blame. It's the weather. It's the government. It's my doctor. It's my kids. It's my boss. Whatever it happens to be, right? There's all kinds of excuses that are out there. But my own observation of people that are successful, they don't spend time blaming anyone, even if there are people legitimately to blame, because what good does that do for us if we're trying to reach forward and truly reach that full measure of our potential? So I just have this philosophy. I'm not going to worry about what coulda, shoulda been. It doesn't really matter. Only what's in front of me and those I love that I can carry forward with me and help lead to their potential, my potential, all these things in combination. That's really what matters. It's this present. I'm only going to look back so far as into number 3, which is the self-examination and the learning. So be responsible, recognize the power of this choice, self-examination or learning, as well as whatever happens, dealing with it, owning it, and moving on. So with all that said, let me offer just a couple of pro tips, and these are really things born of personal experience. First, this is a practice. It's a doctrine that you practice, and you're going to have days where you do it well, and you're going to have days where your frustration gets the best of you. Just recognize that. Just realize you won't do this perfectly, or if you do, big clap for you, right? Because that's not easy to do. Just recognize it's a practice as much as anything. Focus on the process and the activities in that regard, treating it like practice, just like if you ever played sports or you were in music or whatever it happens to be, right? So to just recognize that. Next, vanity plays a role here. Here's what I mean by that. Certainly too much vanity isn't a great idea, but it's important to cultivate within yourself that you care about your results. If you find that you're involved in activity and good or bad, it just doesn't matter to you, it doesn't stir an emotion, you might reconsider the activity you're involved with because it's not one bringing forth your passion and not one you really care about. And from a general standpoint, you're not going to be successful at something that you just don't care about. So do you care about the results you're generating? Do they really matter? And if they do some, but you believe they should more, then it's important to consider why you're doing what you're doing. You know, what is the outcome you're really looking for, and does that outcome really matter to you? If you continue on your path, the arc of progression that you're on, will you be excited about where you'll be in 3 years? Are you doing the things to get better, taking charge of the process to be there in 3 years or 5? So recognize that caring about your success, I kind of refer to it as vanity, is an important aspect of it. You can't have too much though, right? You gotta keep that in balance, but it's a thing. Next, number 3 is resilience or grit. I wished I could recall the author. It just sort of flashed in my mind. There's a great book written a few years ago about a psychology professor about the role of grit in success. A lot of research on people that are successful, historical figures, people inside the military, politics, regular everyday life, all these sort of circumstances, talking about sort of this positive deviation where people break free of circumstances for no identifiable reason except for the fact they've got this grit and determination. That counts for a lot and plays a role, but your grit isn't going to show up if you're caught up in blaming others or outside circumstances, right? Grit really only shows up when a person is accountable for the activities that they're involved with and the performance that they're giving, right? So grit plays a role. Resilience is a part of that. And so grit and resilience is something for you to think about. And then the final thing that I'll leave you with is that your internal police matter too. Making sure that to yourself, you're thinking about this from an accountability standpoint. Now, I'll tell you, I refer to it as your internal police, right? But it's also external, right? When you're involved with any kind of activity, when you're trying to reach beyond, say, a set of circumstances you're involved in now, it's important that you be willing to make some kind of public declaration for that. Now, I don't necessarily mean you got to post it on your Facebook wall or anything like that, but those that are around you and know you, if you're not willing to share with them what you're trying to accomplish, then your chances of accomplishing it diminish greatly. For example, smokers that are trying to quit, if they don't tell their spouse or other people that might say, hey, I thought you were trying to quit, or whatever happens to be, their likelihood of being success diminishes greatly, right? So it's important that you be willing to have some level of public accountability to go with your own internal policing of yourself in terms of being successful and enjoying the highest level of success that you can. With that, let me say this. There's several benefits of this. Number one, I believe all of this builds confidence. The minute you are accountable, you've got a chance to build your self-esteem because you're not blaming other people. Number two, I believe a benefit will be the success that you enjoy. But maybe number three, the most important one I'll leave you with, is you're going to grow at a personal level, your skills, your emotion, your relationships with your spouse, your children, your boss, your family, your community, your success inside your work is going to increase greatly. So with that, thought I would share with you today my observations about being accountable, taking ownership of that idea. I'm Eddie Stone, looking forward to talking to you on our next live. Bye for now.